This time we're tackling Kevin J. Mitchell's Free Agents, How Evolution Gave Us Free Will.
It is a really dense book, like a lot of really great information.
Okay, so let's dive right in. I I think one of the most intriguing starting points in the book is this idea that life isn't so much about static objects as it is about dynamic, self-sustaining patterns of activity.
Right.
He uses these really cool analogies like, a storm or a flame, like it's
Yeah.
always changing, but it's somehow persisting.
Yeah. And what I think is really interesting is how he then links this persistence to DNA.
Mhm.
So, like, he views DNA as a record, a history of a lineage. And this history is being shaped by natural selection. And so you can almost think of it as like a blueprint, but one that's undergoing continuous, like, revisions and refinements.
Okay, so it's not just the information that's in the DNA itself, but also how that information is then being acted upon and modified over time by the environment.
Precisely. Yeah, it's very dynamic.
Okay, and then he even goes so far as to say that the genome itself can be seen as a model of the cell and its fit to its environment.
Right. It's that fitness that drives evolution.
Hmm.
So it pushes these organisms towards greater adaptability.
Okay, so we have this view of life as self-sustaining patterns and persistence.
Hmm.
How does this then connect to free will?
Well, I think for Mitchell, it all begins with action.
Okay.
So even the simplest organisms have to act upon their environment to survive.
Right.
They have to. But this action isn't random.
Yeah.
It's guided by information.
And not just any information, but he talks about relative information.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Relative information refers to how the internal state of a cell reflects aspects of the external environment.
Okay.
So think about like E. coli bacteria.
Hmm.
And they use their flagella to swim toward food sources. They're not just doing this randomly, they're processing information and making decisions based on that information.
Right. I remember that example from the book. It's not just a stimulus response kind of reaction.
Yeah,
They're integrating multiple measurements, like comparing those measurements over time to create a map of their surroundings,
it's almost a rudimentary form of cognition, you could say,
even at that level.
even in these single-celled organisms. Yeah.
Wow. So we're already seeing like the seeds of agency there.
Right.
These organisms acting on the environment in a non-random, goal-directed way.
What I really appreciate about Mitchell's book is he doesn't get lost in the philosophy. Instead, he's like, let's look at the biology of agency, the evolution. Even simple organisms show us the pieces of what we eventually call free will.
Yeah, it's such a cool perspective shift. And it really makes you think about those big questions in a whole new light. So Mitchell starts off by defining life in this really unique way.
Totally. Like, he's not talking about the dictionary definition.
Right.
He describes life as this self-sustaining pattern, this activity that's constantly working to persist through time.
Okay, I can see that. But how does he connect that idea of a self-sustaining pattern to agency? I
Yeah.
mean, we're talking about bacteria here.
Right. Well, he points out that even single-celled organisms, like think of bacteria,
Yeah.
they're actively maintaining a separation between themselves and the environment. Like, they're taking in energy, they're expelling waste, they're essentially working to keep themselves going.
So they're not just passively existing. They're actually putting in effort.
Exactly. They're persisting.
Okay, I get that. But is that really agency? I mean, are they not just following their program? Like, isn't it all just automatic for a bacteria?
That's where it gets really interesting, right? Because Mitchell argues that even bacteria, they exhibit basic forms of decision-making. They gather information from their environment, and they use that information to actually guide their actions.
Oh, interesting. Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Okay, so picture E. coli bacteria, right? They use these little flagella, like tails, to move toward food sources.
I remember that from bio class, yeah.
Yeah. But here's the thing. It's not just a simple automatic response like a robot. They're actually taking in multiple measurements, like sensing chemical gradients and building a special map of their environment.
Wow. So they're processing information and making decisions based on that information.
Exactly. It's not just a reflex.
That is amazing for something so tiny.
It is. And Mitchell's argument is that this basic form of information processing and decision-making, it's like a precursor to the much more complex abilities that we see, in a higher organism.
Okay, my mind is a little blown. So if bacteria can have this basic agency, what happens as things get more complex? Like, what about multicellular organisms?
He gets into that, and one of the coolest examples he uses is slime mold, specifically Dictyostelium discoideum.
Wait, slime mold, like the stuff that can solve mazes.
The very same.
Yeah.
But what's truly wild about slime mold is how it transitions between states. So it starts as a bunch of individual amoebas all doing their own thing.
Okay.
But when food gets scarce, they come together and aggregate into a multicellular slug.
Wait, so they go from being individuals to becoming a single organism?
Yep. And this slug, it moves as one unit, it's guided by chemical signals, and then eventually it finds a suitable spot and transforms again.
Into.
A fruiting body with spores that can disperse and start the whole cycle over.
That is so crazy. So are you saying they're showing agency at both the individual and the collective level?
That's exactly it. And here's the even crazier part. All of this, like the transitions, the behavior, it's guided by communication and cooperation between cells using chemical signals.
Wow, it's like a mini society.
Right. And Mitchell uses this example to show how evolution of multicellularity, with cells specializing and working together, it really opened up the possibilities for even more complex types of agency to develop.
Okay, so we've gone from bacteria making basic decisions to slime mold, showing this collective agency. But how do we get from there to, like, I don't know, a worm with a nervous system and a brain?
So there's this major challenge that organisms had to overcome, and that is size. Single-celled organisms can only get so big. They run into limits with energy production, transport, all that.
Right, makes sense.
But Mitchell explains that symbiosis, that's where the breakthrough happened.
Symbiosis, like two organisms working together.
Exactly. Like, think about mitochondria. They're essential parts of our cells now.
The powerhouses of the cell.
I remember. But get this. Mitochondria were once free-living bacteria.
No way.
Yes. They were engulfed by other cells, this process called endosymbiosis, and over time, they integrated, became part of the cell, and that gave a huge energy boost.
So they teamed up and created something even better.
Right. And this merging of two different life forms, it was massive for evolution. It allowed for larger, more complex organisms to arise with way more sophisticated ways of interacting with their environment.
So symbiosis paved the way for bigger organisms. But how did they get the ability to coordinate their actions, to process information in a more, I guess, sophisticated way?
That's where nervous systems come in. And Mitchell uses the example of Hydra, the simple creature with a nerve net.
A nerve net.
Yeah, it's basically this network of nerve cells that can trigger different body movements. Super primitive, but compared to organisms without any specialized nerve cells, it's a big leap.
So it's like a really, really basic nervous system.
Exactly. Allows for more coordinated action. And from there, nervous systems just get more and more complex. Like Mitchell talks about C. elegans, a tiny round worm, but it has sensory neurons, motor neurons, interneurons, the whole shebang.
Whoa, so it's like different types of neurons all working together.
Yeah, like a hierarchy of information processing. Sensory neurons pick up stimuli. Motor neurons control muscles. And the interneurons, they're the communicators, connecting those signals and making responses more complex and flexible.
So we're starting to see a real brain here.
Exactly. And along with nervous systems, you have the evolution of the senses. Vision, especially, was huge. It expanded what organisms could perceive, and that led to even more complex cognition.
Right, because once you can see, you have a much richer understanding of the world around you. So many more possibilities.
Precisely. And Mitchell goes into detail about the evolution of the eye, from simple light-sensitive cells to the complex eyes we see in animals today. He even talks about how the brain processes all that visual information.
Sounds like that could be a whole deep dive on its own.
It really could be. But the point is, perception isn't passive. We don't just see the world objectively. We're actively building a model of it in our brains.
So we're interpreting everything based on our own experiences and expectations.
Exactly. And that's key for agency, because it means organisms can build these sophisticated internal models of the world, which allows for even more complex decision-making and planning.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, from bacteria to more complex organisms with nervous systems, senses. But how does this all lead to the kind of conscious, deliberate decision-making that we think of when we talk about free will?
That is the big question, isn't it?
Right. I mean, are we saying a worm has free will?
Well, Mitchell tackles that head-on. And he argues that free will, it's not this all or nothing thing. It's more like a spectrum of abilities, and those abilities have evolved over time. So while a worm might not have the same kind of conscious awareness that we have, it's still showing a basic form of agency that laid the groundwork for more complex forms of free will to develop.
Okay, so it's like a continuum. Different organisms, different levels of agency, all depending on their evolution.
Right, and understanding that evolutionary perspective, that's crucial for understanding the nature of human free will.
This is already so fascinating. Anything else we should highlight about this first part of the book?
Yes, I think it's important to emphasize that Mitchell isn't saying that we're just puppets controlled by our genes or evolution. It's not about everything being predetermined.
Okay, good, because that would be a bit depressing.
Right. He's saying that our biology, our evolutionary history, it provides the foundation for free will, but it doesn't dictate the whole story.
So our biology sets the stage, but we still have the power to make choices and shape our own lives.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that. All right, well, we've got a great foundation here. Where do we go from here? How does Mitchell build on these ideas to explain how we got to human free will?
Ah, that's where things get even more interesting. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll be exploring how the brain, especially the cortex and other forebrain structures, evolved to allow for much more sophisticated planning, decision-making, and even something called metacognition.
Metacognition. Ooh, that sounds like we're getting into the deep stuff.
We are, but don't worry. Mitchell makes it all very clear and understandable.
Can't wait. So everyone listening, make sure you tune in for part 2 of our deep dive into free agents. Okay, so we're back and ready to dive even deeper into Free Agents by Kevin Mitchell. Last time we left off talking about the evolution of nervous systems, even simple creatures like Hydra and C. elegans showing a basic kind of agency.
Right, those are great examples.
Yeah. So where do we go from there? Like, how do we get from those simpler systems to the amazing brains that humans have that let us make conscious choices?
That's where the evolution of the brain really takes center stage, especially the forebrain. Mitchell focuses on the development of the cortex, that layered structure that handles all those higher-level cognitive functions.
Okay, the cortex, that's like the command center, right?
Exactly. It's where all the complex processing happens. And as the cortex expanded over evolutionary time, it let organisms develop even more sophisticated ways of interacting with the world.
So what kind of developments are we talking about?
Well, a key one is the evolution of the hippocampus, that structure that's super important for learning and memory.
The hippocampus.
Yeah.
That's what helps us remember things.
It's a big part of that system, yeah. But it's not just about storing memories, it's about connecting them. The hippocampus helps us see the relationships between things, understand cause and effect, build a real understanding of the world around us.
So it's like the hippocampus is helping us create a mental model of how things work.
Exactly. And being able to build that model, that's essential for making those more sophisticated decisions, planning for the future, acting in a goal-directed way.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got the cortex, the hippocampus, this ability to build a mental model. But how does that actually translate into making choices? Like, how does the brain decide what to do?
Mitchell talks about a process of simulation and evaluation. He says our brains are constantly generating potential actions, mentally trying them out, and evaluating what might happen as a result.
Oh, that's interesting. Like running through different what-if scenarios in our heads.
Exactly. Trying to figure out the best way forward. And Mitchell argues this whole process is driven by something he calls predicted utility.
Predicted utility.
Yeah, basically the brain is trying to pick the action that it thinks will result in the most benefit or reward.
So we're not just acting randomly. There's a purpose behind our actions.
Right. We're always aiming for the best possible outcome, at least from the brain's perspective. Of course, we don't always get it right, but the intention is there.
Makes sense. But what about things like habits? Don't they influence our decisions too? Like sometimes we just act without really thinking, right?
Absolutely. Mitchell talks about the role of habits. They're like shortcuts, ways to navigate familiar situations without having to consciously deliberate every single time.
So habits are efficient, but they can also make us less flexible.
That's the trade-off. They can be super useful, but they can also lead us to make choices on autopilot without fully considering the situation or the potential consequences. Mitchell suggests being mindful of our habits and being willing to break out of them when needed.
So it's like finding that balance between efficiency and conscious decision-making.
Right. And then there's the role of randomness in all of this, which might seem counterintuitive.
Wait, randomness? I thought we were talking about making rational decisions.
We are, but Mitchell argues that those inherent fluctuations in neural activity, that randomness, can actually be helpful.
How so?
Well, sometimes our rational decision-making processes get stuck. We go back and forth between options, can't decide. Randomness can break us out of those ruts, introduce a little chaos that leads to a new direction.
Oh, that's a cool way to think about it, like shaking things up to see what new patterns emerge.
Exactly. And Mitchell also argues that randomness can boost exploration and creativity. If we always made decisions based on what we already know, we might miss out on discovering something new.
Okay, so sometimes a little bit of randomness can lead to more innovation and adaptability.
Yeah.
But how does all of this connect to conscious decision-making? to that feeling of being in control of our choices.
Now we're getting into the really fascinating stuff. Mitchell delves into the complex relationship between conscious awareness and decision-making, and he even brings up that famous Libet experiment.
Oh, yeah, the one that suggests decisions are made before we're even consciously aware of them. A little creepy, right?
Right. It led some people to think free will is just an illusion, that our brains are calling the shots before we even realize it.
Yeah, not a very comforting thought. So what does Mitchell say about that? Does he agree?
Not necessarily. He talked about a different interpretation of the Libet experiment called the Sugar interpretation.
Okay, tell me more.
So this interpretation suggests that the brain is always generating these fluctuations in neural activity, and conscious awareness that arises when those fluctuations cross a certain threshold.
So it's not that our brains are making decisions for us, but that our conscious awareness takes some time to catch up, to emerge from all that neural activity.
Exactly, and that's a crucial distinction. It means consciousness, while not some separate entity controlling our actions, is still a vital part of the decision-making process.
Okay, so it's more nuanced than just free will versus no free will.
Absolutely. Mitchell argues that free will is a spectrum, a range of capacities that evolved over time. We're definitely influenced by our biology, our experiences, the randomness in our brains, but we're not just robots following a script. We can reflect on our choices, evaluate our motivations, make decisions based on our reasons, and those choices have real impact on the world.
So we do have agency, but it's this complex, multi-layered kind of agency that comes from biology, experience, and consciousness all working together.
Exactly. And that leads to another really important part of Mitchell's argument, meaning. He says thoughts aren't just patterns in our brains, they're patterns that mean something. And it's that meaning that drives how things unfold in our brains.
Okay, hold on. I need to unpack that a bit. So it's not just about neurons firing. It's about what those firing patterns represent, what information they're carrying, and how that information gets interpreted based on our own experiences and goals.
Precisely. Mitchell uses the analogy of communication between neurons. When they talk to each other, they're not just sending a signal, they're interpreting the meaning of that signal within the whole network.
So it's like a conversation where the meaning comes from the interaction, not just the individual words.
Perfect analogy. And being able to extract meaning from all that neural activity, that's what allows us to form beliefs, have goals, and intentions. It's how we make sense of the world and act in a way that has purpose.
Okay, so meaning is super important, but how does it actually get encoded in the brain? Like, is there a meaning center?
Not exactly. Mitchell talks about meaning being distributed throughout the brain, reflected in how the brain is structured and the patterns of activity. He uses this idea of mapping, where different aspects of the world and our relationship to it are represented in an organized way across different brain regions.
So it's like a map where different parts of the brain represent different pieces of information.
Right, and that map is constantly being updated and refined through our experiences, shaping how we understand the world and our place in it.
That makes sense. But if meaning is so crucial for agency, how does it develop in the first place? Do we start with a blank slate?
Mitchell argues against the blank slate idea. He says even though our genes don't dictate every detail of our brains, they do provide a blueprint for how it develops. And that blueprint includes innate tendencies that shape our personalities and our abilities.
So we're not completely free to become anything. Our biology does set some boundaries.
True, but those boundaries aren't absolute. Mitchell emphasizes how much our innate tendencies and our experiences interact. Our genes influence our brain development, our brain shapes our experiences, and those experiences further shape our brains. It's this constant back and forth.
Like a nature and nurture dance where both partners are leading at different times.
Exactly. And this interplay, it leads to the development of our unique characters. Our experiences, guided by our innate tendencies, they shape our habits, our values, our beliefs. They make us who we are.
So it's not just about the choices we make in any given moment. It's about the patterns of choices we make over time, the story we build about ourselves and what we want.
Precisely. And those stories, those narratives, they have a powerful influence on our actions and ultimately our lives.
This is all so fascinating, and I feel like we're just scratching the surface. What else does Mitchell explore when it comes to how human agency develops?
Well, there's one more key concept that plays a huge role in our capacity for free will, and that's metacognition.
Meta what now?
Metacognition. It's the ability to think about our own thinking. It's like being able to step back and observe our mental processes, evaluate our beliefs and desires, and make conscious choices about how we think and act.
Whoa, that sounds intense. Like having an inner observer who can make adjustments.
Exactly. And Mitchell says this metacognitive ability is crucial for human agency. It lets us not just react to the world, but to reflect on our reactions and change them if we want.
So it's like this extra layer of awareness that allows us to make more deliberate choices instead of just going with our gut all the time.
Precisely. And this ability is linked to the development of the prefrontal cortex, that part of the brain that's much larger in humans than in other
The
primates.
prefrontal cortex, that's like the CEO of the brain, right?
Yeah.
Making the big decisions and keeping everything running smoothly.
Great analogy. The prefrontal cortex gets input from all over the brain and uses that information to guide our actions, manage our emotions, plan for the future. It's what lets us override impulses, resist temptations, and make those long-term plans.
So it's thanks to the prefrontal cortex that we can really exercise our free will, make choices based on our values, instead of just reacting to whatever urge pops up.
Exactly. That ability to consciously control our thoughts and actions, that's a hallmark of human agency.
Okay, this is all mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah.
But there's one thing I'm still grappling with. Consciousness itself. Where does that fit into all of this?
Ah, the million-dollar question. It's been a mystery for ages, hasn't it?
Right.
Mitchell acknowledges that we still don't fully understand consciousness, how it arises from the physical stuff of the brain. But he suggests it might be deeply connected to our ability for metacognition. Maybe it's the act of modeling our own thinking, reflecting on our beliefs and desires, that gives rise to conscious experience itself.
So it's not that consciousness is a separate thing controlling our brains, but that it emerges from all those neural processes, that constant back and forth in the brain as we make sense of the world and decide how to act.
And that emergent consciousness, with its ability to reflect on itself and imagine different possibilities, that's what gives us the freedom to create, explore, and really shape our own lives.
That's beautifully put. We've come a long way from those single-celled organisms with basic agency to this incredible capacity for self-reflection and conscious choice.
It's been quite a journey through evolution. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore what all of this means for the future, especially with artificial intelligence advancing so rapidly.
Right. We're living in a time where the lines between humans and machines are getting blurrier by the day. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into free agents. We've been exploring how agency evolved, from those single-celled organisms all the way to consciousness and humans.
It's been a wild ride through evolution, hasn't it?
It really has. But now things get even more interesting because we're going to shift gears and look towards the future, especially with all the crazy advancements in artificial intelligence.
Right, AI is changing everything so fast.
It feels like we're on the brink of creating machines that can think and act like humans, or at least in ways that we used to think were only possible for humans. So where does Kevin Mitchell stand on all this? Like, does he think we're creating machines that have free will?
That's the big question, right? And Mitchell doesn't shy away from it. He acknowledges all the progress we've made in AI. We have machines that learn, recognize patterns, make decisions, even carry on conversations that can feel eerily human.
Yeah, it's incredible what AI can do now.
It really is. But Mitchell argues there's a key ingredient still missing in these systems. They don't have a real reason to act.
Okay, so they can do things,
Yeah.
but they don't have their own goals or motivations. They're just following our instructions, essentially.
Exactly. They're tools, not agents. Their actions are determined by the goals we program into them. They don't have their own internal drives, their own desires, their own sense of purpose.
That makes sense. But couldn't we, like, theoretically program those goals into them? If we can make machines that learn and adapt, couldn't we also make them have their own motivations?
Mitchell suggests that it might be possible, but it would require a totally different way of thinking about AI. He says that for artificial agents to have general intelligence, they'd need an internal structure that's more like a living organism, something like instincts, a master function that gives value to different actions and states, that guides them towards certain goals and away from others.
So it's not just about programming in a specific goal, like make coffee or write a poem. It's about creating a system that has its own internal compass, its own sense of what's important and what it wants to achieve.
It's about giving them a kind of artificial drive, a motivation to act that's not just coming from us. Mitchell suggests maybe building in pre-configured control policies like innate approach or avoidance responses to guide their initial interactions with the world.
So like giving them a basic set of rules for navigating the world, and then they can build on that and develop their own unique motivations.
Precisely. And from there, they could learn and adapt through experiences, just like we do. They could gain knowledge, discover new patterns, form new goals, and maybe even develop a sense of self.
That's a pretty profound thought. So we're not just talking about making machines smarter, we're talking about making them more like us. Machines with their own inner lives, their own sense of purpose, maybe even their own form of free will.
That's the possibility Mitchell raises. It's something we need to really think about. If we're on the verge of creating machines that can think and act with that level of autonomy, we need to start considering the ethical implications. What kind of future do we want to build with these technologies?
I totally agree. This isn't science fiction anymore. It's a conversation we need to be having now. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways from free agents? What should our listeners be thinking about?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that free will isn't some magical human invention. It
Mhm.
didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's a capacity that's been evolving for billions of years, going all the way back to the very beginning of life. Even those simple organisms show basic forms of agency, making decisions based on information from their environment.
Right. And that agency has just gotten more and more complex over time as organisms develop more sophisticated ways of interacting with the world.
Exactly. And for humans, that complexity led to consciousness, this ability to reflect on ourselves and our choices and act in ways that align with our values and goals.
But as Mitchell points out, that doesn't mean we have total freedom. We're still influenced by our biology, our past experiences, all those random processes in our brains.
Of course. But within those limitations, we have this amazing capacity for choice. We can shape our lives, create new possibilities, and play a role in the evolution of our species.
And maybe, just maybe, as Mitchell suggests, we're on the cusp of creating a whole new kind of agent, a machine intelligence that could have its own form of free will.
It's a possibility that's both exciting and a little bit scary. And it's something we need to approach with careful consideration and a sense of wonder.
Well said. This deep dive into free agents has been a real eye-opener. It's made me rethink everything I thought I knew about free will, consciousness, and what it means to be an agent in a world that's constantly changing. I highly recommend this book to anyone who's curious about these big questions.
I second that. It's a book that will stay with you long after you finish it, and it might just spark some new thoughts about the future of intelligence, both human and artificial.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.